friend up in Syracuse University, and I asked her, who she might recommend, and she listed me some names, but of course she ended the message by saying you could always invite the world-renowned Penny Sparke. And so it's a real pleasure to have her here tonight, traveling from London to be with us, so thank you. We appreciate that. She is a professor of design history and director of Modern Interiors Research Center at Kingston University. She graduated from the University of Sussex in 1971 with a BA in French literature. She was awarded a postgraduate certificate in education in 1972, and from 72 to 75 she studied for a doctorate at Brighton Polytechnic. Her thesis is entitled Theory and Design in the Age of Pop. She's an honorary senior fellow at the Royal College of Art, and she's an honorary, Since 1975, she's taught history of design to undergraduates and postgraduate students in Brighton Polytechnic, and from 1981 to 1999 at the Royal College of Art. She's also, since that time, worked in the field of 19th and 20th century design history, and has lectured, curated exhibits, broadcast, and published widely in the field in both UK and overseas. In addition, in her numerous articles and book chapters, she authored a book including An Introduction to Design Culture, 1900 to the Present, Japanese Design, and also Italian Design. She has over 20 books published. We were talking about that a little bit tonight. But in 1995, she published As Long as It's Pink, The Sexual Politics of Taste. A special interest has become the meaning of design within the context of consumption and its relationship with gender identity. And from the mid-1990s, she has focused her attention on the subject matter of the interior. In 2005, she published a monograph entitled Elsie DeWolf, The Birth of the Modern Interior Decoration, and her book, The Modern Interior, was first published in June of 2008. It is actually my pleasure here to introduce Penny. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to be here.
Can you hear me anyway? Oh, it is working. Good, good, good. I can hear myself echoing now. Well, David, thank you very much. That's a very nice prelude, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, and I had a great day yesterday going around the studio, so I thank all the faculty that helped me do that yesterday. It was great. I'm really enjoying being here. A fun day today as well. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you, I shouldn't really call it the history of the interior design profession, I should call it a history, because I think there are many different histories, and this is just one version that I've put together, and I think you can look at it various ways, but and you can track it through different routes, but I'm just giving you one version today, which we can discuss afterwards. Okay, so emerging as it did in the years after the Second World War, interior design in the form in which we currently recognize it is a relatively young profession. So as a profession, not so old. However, it's got roots like all professions. And it's not to say that interior design did not occur before 1945. Of course it did. On one level, it's taken place, and I've just given you the beginning of time, if you like, it's taken place ever since man first drew on the walls of caves. However, unlike that of architecture, the history of interior design has not been a simple or consistent story. Many different kinds of people have engaged in what we now call interior design. They've included architects, engineers, upholsterers, interior decorators, department stores employees, home economists, space planners, and amateur housewives, among many others. I'm just listing you some. And most recently, we can add interior architecture, as we have here, and a new profession, which I'll mention later a bit, interior scapers, which is to do with plants. So a lot of people working on interiors. Indeed, as a profession, interior design has been a long contested field, I think, in some ways. It's always trying to find its parameters, its boundaries, where does it sit, where doesn't it sit. And that contestation has mostly been with architects, I say controversially, but I think it probably has. There's that little boundary dispute or discussion that goes on all the time. Architects who since the Renaissance in the 16th century have taken on the responsibility for the design of the inside spaces of buildings. Just reminding you of your classical past, two Palladian build, well, a Palladian building rather, and an interior of another one on the right there. In England, the work of Inigo Jones in the 17th century, the banqueting house, echoing obviously classical roots, has also embraced both interior and exterior, as did that of William Kent. These are all very familiar to you, but just remind you that architects there's that tradition of them working on the outside and the inside, as we well know. Now, I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call interior decoration, and I have to use the term because historically that's the way it was described. So by the 19th century, the idea of decorating the interior had become a commonplace. But the two terms, interior and decoration, hadn't always denoted a single concept. It was actually a French invention, the term, and it first appeared in print in this title here, which if you can see it, it is Charles Percier and Antoine Fontaine's Recueil de Décoration Intérieure. Can you see the two words there, just below the title there? First published as articles in 1801, so it's just into the 19th century that the combination of those two words coming together. In the English language, looking on the right now, the term was first used in 1807 in the title of Thomas Hope's publication, Household Furniture and Interior Decoration. That's the first time the term was used in the English language. At that date, the concept was linked exclusively to the household and did not extend to the public sphere. It's very much a domestic, wealthy arena, as you can imagine. Just to give you a sense of what they meant by interior decoration, a publication of 1829 described it as the planned coordination for artistic effect of colours and furniture, etc., in a room. So very clear, very simple, early 19th century. The 19th century also saw the emergence of the large decorating companies who supplied all the components of the interiors for wealthy clients. These companies weren't rooted in architecture, and this is a sort of beginning of a kind of shift away from architecture being the root of it all. Companies like Lenigon and Morant, Charles Alavoine, a couple of slides of the interiors undertaken by that company, and in the USA, the Herter brothers, interiors and furniture. And this was sort of interesting in the sense that they worked from the furniture out, if you like. They supplied the furniture and all the other accompaniments for an interior, and then would, for a wealthy client, clearly would undertake the total decoration of the interior. So that's a very particular group of people. The 19th century was also the time when interior decoration became available to people other than the very wealthy. So it sort of starts inevitably as a kind of wealthy person's privilege and filters down in this period of sort of a moment of increases in disposable income and social mobility. So more and more people are able to think about the importance of taste in their homes. And I think taste is the key term in this period. And taste means a number of things. It's a marker of social status, clearly, and a means of establishing both collective and individual identities. So I think it's both sort of outward and inward looking. This was also the moment, the sort of mid-19th century, when a notion of a private and a public divide came into being. There hasn't always been that sense of the sort of the private world that we inhabit and then the public world we step into. It's that's sort of historically formed, I think. It was also the period of the emergence of the middle-class home and the responsibility for domestic taste falling to the female of the house. So this is, again, a historical moment. It wasn't always that women decorated, but in the mid-19th century, we have something called the separation of the spheres, which historians talk about. And that's the moment, really, where middle-class women stayed at home to look after the children and the home. Men went out, worked in the office, the bank, whatever, with 9 to 5 becoming the normal, that kind of thing. Before that, there was a much more, before urbanization, really, there was a much more sort of shared sense of responsibility between male and female, but that this divide becomes very strong in this period. I think the private face of the modern interior and its decoration was formed in the middle-class Victorian home. That space performed a number of simultaneous roles, but primary among them, a comforting refuge from the worlds of work and commerce. So as these two spheres develop, the home becomes the place where you escape from the other, the world of commerce, money, timekeeping, etc. So the notion of home as haven develops at this time, in Britain certainly. It's been there in the Netherlands for a little longer, but in Britain that's where it comes into being. Let me show you a couple of 19th century interiors as while I talk. Not particularly great slides, I'm afraid, but they give you a sense of that sort of space that I'm talking about. As the 19th century progressed, the Victorian home also became a focus for aesthetic intervention, a destination for goods acquired through mass consumption, and a focus for media attention. And what happens really is that as the notion of home becomes the norm, and I've talked already about upward emulation, the notion of home becomes idealized. It's not just something you live in, it's something you aspire towards, something perhaps out of your reach, but you're moving up the social scale, and there's a model of the interior that you aspire to. And that model of the interior would be found in the media, in magazines, in World's Fairs, etc. It would be something you went and visited and thought, I'd like to live in that house. We're familiar with that now, but that wasn't always the case. And that's very much to do with taste and social mobility. As well as offering opportunities for privacy, social activities also went on in the 19th century domestic arena, which meant that there was opportunity for both privacy but also for social display. So, as I say, it's again working two ways. I'll give you two more images of mid-19th century homes. The word that comes to mind usually is clutter. That's the word that's always used to describe the mid-19th century home. And I think it's quite hard for us to look back at it and realise that it didn't look cluttered to them. That's why they wanted it to look. So they had as much objects as they wanted around them to express the meanings they wanted to. It's only with our sort of retrospective look that we sort of look at it and say, what a mess, what a lot of clutter. I think it was a site where modern femininity, as we know it, was largely negotiated. In other words, the woman was a very key focus, where fashionableness could be demonstrated. So there was an aspiration to be fashionable and to demonstrate that through your home. And of course, this was the first time that the middle classes could do that. The wealthy had always done that, the aristocratic had always done that, but the first time the middle class could do it. And I think very importantly, where women could express themselves through their new role as decorators. And the main point really is that the women in this division of labour that I've talked about, and women staying in the home, they became responsible for decoration, not necessarily for the actual physical painting the walls at all, but for the taste decisions that were made that underpinned the way the home was decorated. I'm going to show you just a couple more images, and I'm going to focus on one of them. I'm so sorry that's such a dark slide. Can you see it well enough? Just a bit, the lights are on, which doesn't help. But it's a very ordinary interior. It's actually a typical middle-class living space in Manchester in England. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on it because I think it epitomises things. So typically, the spaces of Victorian domesticity were filled to the brim with items of comfortable upholstered furniture. You can just about, no, actually there's not too much of that there, but there usually is. Textiles on every surface, bibelots on the mantelpiece, which you can see on the right here, these different sort of ceramic objects and decorations. Patterned carpets, can't quite see, but it is there. Potted plants, of which there are quite a few. And in this very typical interior, you can see the crowded mantelpiece, the framed pictures on the wall, suspended from the picture rail, the plants I've mentioned, an eclectic mix of chairs arranged semi-formally around little tables, and a very large religious statue positioned in one corner. And they combine to create an impression of a kind of inward-looking home, dedicated to comfort, self-reflection, social interaction, and private spirituality. So those are the values of this home. And you can just see, if you look to the left, in the middle of the image, just to the left, a woman sitting there reading. And I think that's why I like this image, because the curtains are closed, she's not looking out the window, the outside doesn't exist, it's an inward-looking, reflective, private sort of space. But there is the potential for social display, and those chairs seated around that suggest that people come in and involve themselves in the space. So that's the kind of home that becomes a home of taste. Now, by the second half of the 19th century, that language of Victorian domesticity, which is what I've really spelt out to you, that combination of elements, becomes a language, I think. It becomes a feature not only of indoors, but also of some outdoor spaces, some public and some semi-public, what I'm going to call homes from home. I'll give you a few examples of them. On the left is a cafe On the right is a palm court in a hotel. And there were lots of other spaces, things like cafes, women's clubs, hotels, the leisure areas of department stores, railway waiting rooms, which I think I've got an image of. Yes, on the left there, that's actually a carriage, a railway carriage. And on the right, I think it's an interesting one. It's actually a mental hospital, what they used to call them. They used to call them lunatic asylums, in fact, yes, as I've put up there in the day, which looks like a Victorian parlour. You know, it's got those elements, the comfy chairs, the plants, the pictures on the wall, the patterned wallpaper. And I think that was used as a kind of therapeutic environment, particularly for women. Hysterical women, as they were called in the 19th century, but a feeling of calm and a feeling of at-homeness. So the language of domesticity pervades the outside world as well at this time. And I think the reason for that is sort of quite clear. There's a kind of funny irony that just as the separate spheres are formed, men go out to work, factories, offices are created, women stay in the home to nurture and to decorate and to create a home. It's just at that moment that making goes out of the home, because prior to that, you'd made your own jams, you've sewed, you've done your own home crafts. But with the growth of the factory, of course, a lot of that work goes out of the home. So women actually have to go out of the home to shop, ironically. Rather than actually being able to stay at home and make jam and things, it became an industrialized process. And in order for them to feel comfortable going out of the home, these spaces like, as I say, women's clubs, hotels, railway carriages, were made to look like homes. So it's almost a sense as if they take their domesticity out with them in order to purchase and buy things back for the home. So it's an interesting process that I think happens at that time. Now, that's a kind of background, this story about the Victorian home, because I think it underpins the way in which interior decoration as a profession develops, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The rise of what came to be called the professional lady decorator, I'm sure many of you have heard that term, stemmed from women's responsibility for decoration in the home, and I think marked a milestone in the story of modern interior design. It's one of the steps towards it developing. By the early 20th century, the links between lady interior decorators and taste were fully formulated. Their role was to inject good taste into interiors whose inhabitants lacked the capacity or the confidence, more likely, to do it themselves. So women as amateurs or women as housewives had, as I say, dictated the decoration of their homes through their decision-making, their taste decision-making. And then some women thought, well, this is something we could do as a profession. We could do this for other people. In Britain, the Garrett sisters on the left, a couple called Agnes and Rhoda Garrett, were amongst the first women to make a living for themselves by decorating other people's homes. And in the US, I'm sure all of you know Candace Wheeler and her work, she did the same thing really in the States, very pioneering figure. And of course Edith Wharton and Codman published their very influential Decoration of Houses, which advocates the use of French and Italian neoclassical styles as markers of taste. So this really consolidates the moment when taste equals neoclassical, and and women play a very important role in actually creating interior spaces for people who pay for it to happen. Now, the career of a woman called Elsie DeWolf is very interesting in this context. David mentioned that I've written a book about her, and she's somebody I'm very interested in. I don't know if many of you have heard of her. She was a pioneer, American interior decorator. I just want to say a little bit about her because I think she was very key. She epitomized the role of the interior decorator as tastemaker. Let's have a look at her. Two images of her on the left. I'll start with that. Now, she rose through the ranks of society from being a fairly humble, from a humble middle-class background. Her father was a doctor, and they lived in a brownstone in New York. So she understood what it was to kind of rise through the social spectrum. And she understood the relationship between social aspiration and its material accoutrements. In other words, how you demonstrate your achievement, social achievement. So she was well prepared for that role, having actually done it herself. Also, I think it's very interesting, her first career had been as an actress on the stage, and that's on the image on the right is of her dressed up on the stage. And in that context, she learnt about stage sets and the way in which characters are played out on stage sets. And I think that equipped her in a certain way to think about how the interior works as a kind of set for personalities to evolve and for people to perform their identities. And what she did was transfer her knowledge to the domestic interior. I think she got to the age of about 40. She wasn't actually a very good actress, but she performed the role of a kind of clothes horse, which before fashion shows, the actresses on the stage in the sort of 1890s, that's what they did. They wore couture clothes, things by Worth and the early couturiers, and women went to the theatre to look to look at the dress and then go off and get theirs made afterwards, as they did to see the play. And that's what she did. She was called a clothes horse very often. And she transferred the knowledge she got from the theatre to the domestic interior. Also, a very clever ploy, that the first work she undertook was on her own home, and she lived in Irving Place in New York. You see that on the Lower East Side. And what she did was decorate her own home. There she is lounging on a cosy corner, as they called them. On the right, her hallway, which is in a more French 18th. So she picked up from Wharton that idea of 18th century French style very much. What she did then was to decorate her own home and then invite a lot of people to come round for events, and they had sort of soirees and things in the home. And people would say, what a wonderful home you've got, I wonder if you do mind for me, sort of thing. So she then ceased to be an actress, got herself a little business card, sent it out to everybody, and started decorating other people's homes for money. And she worked on a women's club in New York that Stanford White built, and that was very advantageous for her because women from all over the States came to New York, stayed in this women's club, and of course then they went back to San Francisco, to Chicago, and asked her to decorate their homes in the same style as the club they'd stayed in. So she was a pretty astute businesswoman, really. So in the house she created for herself, she crossed the divide between the world of amateur feminine domesticity, in other words, like an amateur woman doing her own home, and that of a professional interior decorator. And she kind of blurred the distinctions, I think. As a result, she acquired a deep understanding of the ways in which the decoration of the interior can, through the application of taste, play a role in status and identity formation, and the important part played by women's engagement with modernity in that process. These are just two of her interiors for clients. And of course, she's working for wealthy clients in that same tradition. Now, that notion of the lady decorator not being a sort of, being somebody almost like an amateur, but not really an amateur, became very popular. And a number of other women, amongst them Cerie Morm in the UK, and in the US, people like later Dorothy Draper, Rose Cumming, Ruby Ross Wood, Eleanor Macmillan, etc. There was a whole, I'm sure you know all about this, was a whole sort of group of women right through from 1900 through the 20s and 30s, setting themselves up as professional decorators and decorating the house of the wealthy, very often in the French taste, as they called it, because that was the tasteful style. I'd say by 1914, the profession of lady interior decorator was fully formed. In that year, the Decorators Club of New York was also established. By 1931, it had become the American Institute of Interior Decorators, and by 1957, the National Society of Interior Designers. So you can see that there is a straight line of development through the work these people were doing into interior design, which I will talk about for the rest of the talk. But by which time, in 1959, it's become male-dominated. So there's a gender story in the growth, as we know, of interior design. But having said that, not all the early decorators were women. In 1915, Frank Alva Parsons published his book, Interior Decoration, Its Principles and Practices, and he deliberately set out against the lady decorators to say, no, it's a male profession, actually. And he made a very clear statement about the importance of home to men. He said, "The house is but the externalized man, himself expressed in color, form, line, and texture. The house is his house, it is he." And he was really, really overemphasizing the fact that he was trying to reclaim the decorating profession for men, away from the female profession. Now, interestingly, Parsons, you know the Parsons School in New York, so his route was into formal education, and he believed strongly that interior decorators had to be educated. And he'd established the first course, a very early course in not exactly interior decoration, but almost, back in 1904 in New York. And as we know, many educational institutions followed him. So there's a kind of, the women stay they're not trained. They're amateurs. They learn through decorating their own homes and through their own intuition, if you like, whereas the male route is to establish formal education and training. So that's already a kind of, it's not a conflict, a kind of tension and a kind of divide, I think, is what's happening. Now, having said all that, another influence on what was to become interior design was also developing in parallel at this time. And I want to talk now a little bit about home economics, because, and we know that this institution has a base in home economics, which is really interesting. It's about something entirely different. Home economics was not about taste and aesthetics, although that's in there a bit, I think, but really about efficiency in the home. Once again, interestingly, it was driven by women. And I think their motivation was very different from those of the society decorators. They had a vested interest in making their homes more efficient and professionalizing their work. What they were really doing, those early home economists, was saying homemaking is a professional activity. It's serious. Okay, we're not paid for it, but it's serious and we're efficient, just like people working in the factories are efficient, and we want to make our work look efficient and be efficient. Now, back in the middle of the 19th century, which is where this had all begun, a number of female advocates of household efficiency had already begun to articulate ideas about its effects on the home. And sorry, just an image there just to remind you, home economics, this is obviously later in the century, but it's got a lovely look to it, I like it. But let's go back to Catherine Beecher, who really is at the root of this. It was her, Catherine Beecher, the American writer, who'd first, quote, made the art of housekeeping a scientific study. In her 1869 publication, The American Woman's Home, she declared her belief in the idea that a more rational way of working would give women pride and satisfaction in the creation of efficient homes. It was about satisfaction for women being efficient and understanding how to work in a rational way. And she'd also outlined the concept of the rational kitchen, which was at that time situated at the heart of the house. It moves a bit later in rational household thinking, but with Beecher it's at the heart. And you can see this kind of early dividing cupboards and putting names on them was part of this attempt to systematize housework, if you like. So this is an illustration from Beecher's book. So a place for everything, if you like. Now, by the first decade of the 20th century, so Beecher's, 30, 40 years earlier, so by the time we get to the 20th century, the principles of scientific management, as it was called, had transformed the factory and the office. And I'm sure you know all about that. There's a lot of writing about that. But also, it was beginning to affect the home as well. And also by the end of the 19th century, women such as Ellen Swallow Richards, the first woman to enter MIT, and the founder in 1910 of the Journal of Home Economics, had helped turn what was called domestic economy into a discipline capable of being taught. So rather like Parsons wants to teach interior decoration, the home economists want to teach the subject as a scientific discipline. Now, by 1912, the year in which Christine Frederick had become the household editor of Ladies' Home Journal and started to publish a series of articles with the title The New Housekeeping, the effects of scientific management were being directly felt in the domestic arena. I'm sure you've come across Frederick. She's very important. This is her book, The New Housekeeping, Efficient Studies in Home Management. Well, there were a number of different books with slightly different names, but they all had the same feel to it. Now, she focused, as you can see on that image, but perhaps even better on this one, on what she called step saving, which again was taken from the factory. If you're doing mass production in Ford's factory, you want to minimize the amount of steps you take from taking your component to put it on the car. You don't want to walk over to that end of the room, come back and put it on, because you're losing time, and time is money. So step saving was what Frederick advocated, and she created these diagrams of sort of, bad steps, bad moving and good moving, whereby, if you had to organize your kitchen equipment such that you did your things properly. And she had two sequences. One was preparing food and one was cleaning up after food, and they were triangular. And it was very, very systematically thought through. So in her well-organized spaces, the number of steps needed to perform the task of preparing, cooking, and cleaning up after a meal reduced to a minimum. She relegated the kitchen to the back of the house, unlike Beecher, who'd had it in the middle, and made it like a kind of laboratory, like a tiny little add-on laboratory. These are small kitchens for one person only. and she gave the housewife, as you can see here, a sort of little hat. And there were some of them in white lab costumes, laboratory costumes, and seated her on a stool from which she could reach everything. This is very efficient. So you can see her tools. It's like a workman's desk. Her tools are set up there so she can reach. Everything's within reach. I think she's peeling potatoes there straight into the bin. But sitting on the stool allowed her to do it all. I don't know why we stand in kitchens now. It doesn't make any sense at all, because all you're doing is hurting your back. But she had it all organised. So as I say, all the items she needed were available, whether on the open shelving behind her or on the little table. She had a little table on wheels where the things came in, took them off, washed them, put them back on the shelf. And her shelves were always open and exposed because opening doors and shutting doors took time. So it was incredibly efficient. Now, Frederick's attempt to transform the home into an area dominated by reason opened the way for a completely new way of thinking about domestic equipment and furniture and their spatial arrangements. And what it was doing is serving to undermine the Victorian domestic ideology and the idea of the separate spheres, and to align the home with the public rational face of industrial modernity. So it's shifting that meanings that we had in the Victorian period. Okay, now I'm going to shift dramatically to something quite different, but it's the next stage, if you like, in the story. It was within the architectural modern movement that the aesthetic of the modern domestic interior finally emerged, however. Once again, male architects took up the reins, picking up where they'd left off in the 18th century. Now, the roots of the modern interior... Oh, sorry, I've missed a slide there. No, I must have lost it. I'll wait for a moment. The roots of the modern interior lay in what the modernists believed to be the unconscious... Oh, no, actually, I haven't lost it. It comes after this one. So I'm just giving you two images of Corbusian interiors just to show you what I mean by modernist interior. Completely bare, functional, concrete, no decoration, etc. It's the polar opposite of Victorian interior. And the roots of that lay in what the modernists believed to be the unconscious, utilitarian, engineered aesthetic of the new public sphere interiors, things like railway stations, exhibition halls, and you've got Hyde Park there and a railway station here, London Railway Station. And what they did, as you well know, was to bring that aesthetic into the domestic. And what they were doing in doing that was getting rid of what they saw to be the problem of bourgeois domesticity. They did not like bourgeois domesticity or Victorian clutter at all, for political reasons as well as, I think, emotional ones. I also have a theory that most of them were brought up in Victorian cluttered interiors, and it was a kind of, actually, a rejection of that. They sort of wanted to clean the slate and start again. I think it was quite personal. So architecture takes the lead, while the so-called decorative arts, which embraced the interior at that time, follows meekly behind. For the modernists, the interior was simply the space within buildings, an inevitability which, in order for daily life to take place, had to be equipped, albeit as minimally as possible. So you can see that there's these two directions going on, which are quite different. By the 1920s, the international modern movement in architecture and design embraced new materials, as we know, concrete, plate glass, steel frame construction, which in turn has an impact on the interior space. Now, as I said, they're taking the key characteristics of commercial interiors into the domestic arena. And by doing that, they're almost eradicating the interior's role. It's a minimal role it has now. It's not an overt expression of beauty. It's not a space for interiority or identity formation anymore. It's just become, it's not a link to fashionableness, and it's not about social status. It's all the things the Victorian interior have been denied. In their place, they're emphasizing utility and efficiency. And interestingly, the work of Frederick and others and the home economists was very important to the modernists. So that other women's movement, the one that was moving towards efficiency, feeds into architectural and design modernism. Inevitably, the modernist rational approach impacted most strongly on those areas of the house dedicated to work, so the kitchen, the bathroom, etc., but it filters into other spaces here, dining rooms, living room areas as well. And the simple, abstract, geometric, undecorated interior style, which is what I'm showing you here, often referred to as the machine aesthetic, becomes to dominate. And I'm showing you this because although this is high cultural stuff, if you like, it filters pretty quickly into a mass audience, albeit in a modified way. It becomes, in fact, the modern interior aesthetic of the 20th century, in terms, perhaps not of its extremeness, but in terms of the philosophy that's being applied. And as a result of that, the work of the lady decorators gets pushed to the margins, really, to become the preserve only of the very wealthy or the amateur. And there's a backlash against it, as you might expect. Particularly interestingly, what they pick on is their obsession with the antique style. That's what's not liked. And in his book, I don't know if you know this book at all, called Goodbye Mr. Chippendale, T.H. Robespon Gibbings, who was an early interior designer, blamed the decorators for what he saw was the prevalent bad taste around him. And he says this: "The word interior decorating today brings a mental picture of busy people running around with a pick-me-up for wilting upholstery and scouring Third Avenue for something amusing and chic, all for 10% profit." So he's very damning of the antique thing. And he actually says, if the Columbian exhibition led the way for bad modern architecture, Elsie DeWolf led it for bad interior design. So he actually names her as being the one. Now he calls himself, and we're talking, this is 44, his book, so we're into the post-war period almost, he calls himself interior designer. And so the word interior decorator means something else. So he's a member of a new community of aesthetic practitioners which saw itself as highly professionalized and closely aligned with, and above all, equal to architects. So this is the beginning of the interior design profession. So in the years after 1945, I would suggest that modernism maintains its dominance, not necessarily as a style, but as a thought process, as a philosophy, and certainly as an educational set of principles. I'd argue they're still there today, they haven't really gone. But a division of labour occurs such that architects begin to work alongside interior and landscape designers, all of them adhering to the principles and aesthetic of modernism. This coincides with a huge expansion of corporate life and the need for designers to create settings for it. A new generation of designers, mostly male, emerge who become responsible for space planning, services and equipment, as well as furnishings and fittings. And in the process, they facilitate the change from interior decoration to interior design. An English writer writing at about this time defines the interior designer profession as being concerned with planning, scale, heating, lighting, surfaces, furniture, pattern and colour, therefore complementing those of the architect. Importantly also, the interior designer is beginning to be seen as somebody to play a significant role in public interiors as well as domestic ones. So that shift from residential to public happens around the same time. In the mid-1950s, the American interior design press was advocating a shift in designers' activities from residential to contract. Oh, sorry, I'm still showing you modernism. Let's move on. A couple of, if you like, contract interiors from the 50s. A store, just an example of a store and a hotel foyer. The case for the shift was made in the October 1954 issue of Interior Design magazine, and the magazine's editor, who was then Harvey Anderson, explained it is the interior designer with experience in residential work who is doing the best job in the contract field, and it is he also, who can be credited with raising the level of interior designing in the contract field. So that shift takes place around, I mean, it's not sudden, but it happens in a relatively short time. And I think this is the beginning of interior design as we now know it, and as it's taught still in many schools. Now, latter-day modernists saw the work of the decorators inevitably as feminized, trivial, superficial, and believed it overemphasized the role of textiles and ignored architectural structure. Furthermore, they saw interior decoration being linked with things like social aspiration and a link to the media, which were things that they didn't want to do. Now, moving rather quickly now, a generation of architect designers, amongst them people like Charles and Ray Eames, Saarinen, who you can see on the right, Nelson, George Nelson, Harry Botoya, and other people like Alexander Girard, became preoccupied at this time with extending modernism's commitment to creating mass-produced furniture items which could be used equally well at home and in the office. And I think this development of these lines of furniture in this period consolidated that blurring of the domestic and the contract. So these pieces of furniture could be used in either. And that they were a very important staging post, I think, in the blurring of the two arenas. And I'm using the term architect designers here because that's what these people were, but they're actually architect furniture designers, or architect interior and furniture designers. They did the lot. But they were very important in creating that shift. A refusal, in fact, to acknowledge the separation of what I call the spheres, the public and the private spheres, underpinned the work of the designer Florence Knoll and her involvement with the Knoll Planning Unit. And I think she's a very important figure in this shift. Her distinctive achievement was not only to create modern furniture designs, both for the home and for the office, in fact you could use them in either, but also to bring iconic works of others, older modernists, people like Mies, as well as her contemporaries, people like Bertoya and Saarinen, into that new context. She was very similar in sort of bringing those things together. The model of corporate modernism that she helped to create was an extremely powerful one, mirroring the developments in office block building in the USA in the immediate post-war years and into the 60s. And she was an architect by training, as we know. She trained with Gropius and Breuer. And she created, I would say, a new language for the modern office and the home, which was both modern and inhabitable. The 50s design for Knoll Associates San Francisco showroom, which you can see there, which has got Mies chairs in it, as you recognize in the Barcelona chairs, positioned on a textured rug around a glass-topped coffee table, provides a model for countless modernist domestic interiors and commercial reception areas in architect-designed interior spaces. So it epitomizes for me that sort of shift. Now, from the 60s onwards, which is where we've got to, really, interior design continued to assert itself and to claim new territories, and in fact just goes from strength to strength. The mass media brought interior designers into the public arena, and the modern designed interior became a mass phenomenon. It filters through society, really. The determination of many architects to influence and control the interior spaces of their buildings, however, continued to play a very important role. I'm just going to give you some examples. In England, the two architects, John Pawson and Norman Foster, take full responsibility for their interiors, the former particularly supervising every last detail of his strikingly minimal creations, and the latter controlling the design of many of the items destined for his spaces, the furniture, the tables and chairs and things quite often as well. And then, as we all know, many other contemporary architects, people like Jean Nouvel, Frank Gehry, Arata Isazaki in Japan, also have that sense of, it's a kind of neo-modernist sense of controlling the interior spaces. However, by the end of the 20th century, it had become clear that interior design was here to stay. As modernism began to lose its dominance, I mean, it hasn't lost it completely, but it's lost a lot of it, however, I would suggest interior designers sought no new roles. Not only did they work with architects on new buildings, they could also work on old buildings, repurposing them. There's two examples of old buildings that have had interior designers work on them. They didn't need architects to help them to do that, as they had all the technical skills to do it themselves. In the early 21st century, interior design has experienced its own division of labor, as people such as Interior-scape, as I mentioned before, came into the frame, people who were to work on the planting in large spaces. In this instance, providing the planting needed in corporate spaces. Today, interior design / architecture is a multidisciplinary activity, much more complicated, I suggest, than architecture in certain ways. It continues to expand and to establish itself as a discipline, I would argue, that's essential to life in the early 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think we're going to take a few questions.
Thank you very much, Penny. Any questions?
Sorry, I threw a lot of material at you.
Take your time.
Thank you for that illuminating lecture. Could you talk a little bit about Elsie DeWolf and others who, a lot of the spaces you showed were different from contemporary spaces in the sense that they were often as large as this room, and how they made rooms inside of rooms with furnishings?
Oh, Elsie DeWolf and that generation you're thinking of, are you? Yes, well, they worked on very large, domestic spaces owned by the wealthy, really. So they did work on spaces, and they used the 18th century French techniques. Really, they would create areas. They used screens. A lot of them used screens that were used by the 18th century French people, and they created dining areas and conversation. The idea of the conversation area, etc. So they worked in the French style. So the style that would be found in Versailles and places like that. So they were working on because these were massive homes in San Francisco and elsewhere that they worked on. But they used the French 18th century model. all trying to think, what was she talking about?
Well, for those of you who will be at the reception, you can ask questions of Penny there, and we'll meet out in front of room 103 here in a just walk right on over across the atrium. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Was it?
Oh, yeah.
I probably covered a bit too much material in some ways.
Well, I've asked you to...